Hello everyone and welcome to round 4 of the American Monoposto Championship. I'm Josh Cassar, your host as ever, and today the AMC visits the world famous Circuit Gilles Villeneuve in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. But before we get started, let's have our usual look at the news and rumours surrounding the AMC in 2022. Juho Sopanen has had to withdraw from this year's American Monoposto Championship due to personal commitments and time constraints. This might be another blow to MPM since they still struggle to get the rest of the squad up to Kevin Peters' level. James Early is going to be making his AMC debut for his own Streamline Engineering this weekend. We got the chance to talk to the self-proclaimed content creator ahead of the Montreal race weekend.
My expectations for Montreal on a personal level is to just finish the race, really. I've got no expectations of scoring good results right off the bat, as I don't have much experience in the car. So I've been away for a few months from the game, so just finishing the race would be a happy surprise for me. Aims for the team, just to take the team forward. I know we've had quite a troublesome start, and I know that you've stepped down from the race seat, which, restricts the amount of points Streamline can score, really. So I'll just be hoping to move the team forward, improve on their fortunes that they've already had so far through the opening 3 rounds, and see where we can end up by the 10th round of the season.
Lewis Hamilton is going to be joining him in his efforts, though the pace difference does seem to be enormous at this stage. And finally, Daniel Bentham-Reeder is also going to be debuting for the Odilo Racing team. Him, Knežević and Vinter hope to compete with MPM and Costech this weekend. Well, considering that he's one of Kevin Peters' closest competitors, it's notable to say that we haven't really heard from Gonzalez Cativo this season. Our own Simon Core has decided to tell you the story behind the driver with the number 69.
So let me tell you the story of El Cativo. See, back in the early 2010s, somebody would pop up in the world of German sim racing who would come to be known as a bit of an outlaw, if you will. Some would describe him as loyal, others would describe him as incredibly impulsive, but everybody damn sure considered him to be incredibly ambitious. He stood out as one of the most recognizable alter egos in German sim racing to date. See, Cativo wasn't just a randomly picked name, something that somebody just came up with off the cuff. No, Cativo was a tribute to a song by the famous German punk band Die Ärzte called El Cativo. See, El Cativo tells the story of an evil cowboy doing his dirty deeds, succeeding in every way, almost celebrating the arrogance associated with it. And you yourself can speculate as to why that was the origin of the last name, but you can surely argue that there is a certain dark edge to Mr. Cativo, considering that background. Now, Mr. Cativo would become a quite successful sim racer in his day, winning the 2013 Formula World Championship and therefore being recognized by the AMC as a former world champion. But at some point, the old cowboy decided to just ride off into the sunset, having accomplished everything he wanted to accomplish and leaving sim racing behind, at least as a driver. But in 2022, the cowboy decided to return to his saddle and compete in the American Monoposto Championship. And from what we can tell, nobody expected Old Yeller to be competitive, but he was. Cativo started to show pace, and if things had gone differently, he could have won 2 of the first 3 rounds of the championship. But he didn't. Now, of course, the question remains, what does the future hold for El Cativo? Does the story of the old impulsive cowboy get a happy ending, riding off into the sunset one more time as the undisputed American Monoposto champion? Or is Old Yeller gonna get his way shown to the backyard by people like Knežević and Peters?
The Circuit Gilles Villeneuve is known for its tight turns, unforgiving concrete, and the infamous Wall of Champions. Furthermore, this 4.4 kilometer long circuit happens to be one of the toughest tests for brakes this season. Throughout testing, the usual suspects were as competitive as ever, and as expected, one of them took another pole position. It's Kevin Peters on pole position once again, ahead of Knežević, Vinter and Cativo to round out the top 4. Behind them, Daniel Bentham-Reeder and Josh Cassar, and it'll be interesting to see if any of those following young pack can challenge Peters today. James Early qualifies a respectable 7th on his debut ahead of Fekler, who qualifies 8th. Dittmer and Waldinger round out the top 10. Stefan Cerner, Lucas Hamilton and Bartosz Kopieta qualify at the back of the 13-driver grid. And with that, I'll hand you over to your commentator, Mr. Simon Core.
Thank you, Josh. Hello, everybody. It's Saturday. You know what that means. Round 4 of the American Monoposto Championship. It is the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Certainly one of the most interesting tracks in the world. One of the most entertaining for sure, as we're about to start the race. A few people sadly couldn't show up due to personal reasons. One of them due to a COVID infection. Get well soon on that note. But nonetheless, the green flag drops and the race is go. No, Kevin Peters in the lead ahead of Knežević Cativo trying to fight off against the 2 Odilo cars. And as we're about to see, Cativo breaks himself. There might have been contact. And Winter spins in the background. Kazar passes Cativo, so does Fekler. Quite a chaotic start. We're going to look at that in a second in the replay. But meanwhile, Cativo's way back while Peters leads ahead of Knežević. Bentenrieder in 3rd with a great start. Kazar in 4th. Fekler in 5th ahead of Kopieta, Early, and Waldinger. A bit of chaos in the back with the Falcon cars. Another great start for them. Certainly not as impressive as their performance in Interlagos, at least so far. Cativo behind Benz Waldinger. And we're going to look at the start in just a second because we need to figure out what actually happened there with Cativo and the Odilo boys. But meanwhile, Kazar behind Daniel Bentenrieder in 3rd. P4 for the team boss of Super Gazelle. But in the lead, Kevin Peters ahead of Alexander Knežević. Let's look at what happened during the start. Looking at it from Daniel Bentenrieder's perspective, it doesn't look as if he touched Cativo, who heavily outbrakes himself, but we can't be sure with this game. You're certainly all aware of the netcode terminology in iRacing, so it's not 100% certain that Daniel Bentenrieder did or did not hit González Cativo, but from our judgment, he did not hit the driver with the number 69. Therefore, Cativo may be a bit too ambitious into turn 1, trying to overtake his friend Alexander Knežević in that situation. Meanwhile, Jan Winter may be a bit surprised by the fact that Bentenrieder turned in, despite the fact that he was there, spins, and is now way back. He's essentially last at this point, even behind Lucas Hamilton, who had a terrible qualifying session. Now the question remains, how much time can Winter make up with this chaotic field of drivers today? I suspect he can make it into the top 5 still, but we'll have to wait and see. Well, Bentenrieder manages to outbrake himself. Kazar now in P3, but Bentenrieder still has the better exit. Now it depends on whether or not Kazar can actually overtake Daniel Bentenrieder ahead of the infamous Wall of Champions, where world champion class drivers like Damon Hill, Jacques Villeneuve, and Michael Schumacher chucked it into the wall in 1999. Kazar versus Bentenrieder. Those two collide, and miraculously, neither of them have to retire despite it being quite a heavy impact. Bentenrieder still ahead of Josh Kazar. Now, Fekler sees an opportunity to get ahead of the British driver. With a Maltese background, doesn't manage to do so. Kazar still in P4 ahead of Fekler. Bartosz Kopieta versus Cativo behind them. James Early and Benz Waldinger, and the 2 Falcon drivers seem to collide. An erratic start from almost everybody involved. The only 2 who seem to be quite relaxed about the start are Knežević and Peters, who've already managed to get a gap between themselves and the rest of the field. That being, of course, Daniel Bentenrieder, who seems to hold up a portion of the field. Meanwhile, Cativo's ahead of Kopieta, who outbrakes himself, who's now ahead of James Early, of course, streaming the race live, which is why we'll have the opportunity to listen into the team radio from time to time. Kopieta outbrakes himself, bumps into Early, who spins, and he will certainly be pissed off about that, seeing as he was in quite a good position after the start.
I've been dive bombed.
Clear. Caution.
Brilliant. Well, that goes that race. The Streamline boys are now 12th and 13th.
Meanwhile, Winter is trying to fight off the 2 Falcon boys who've had an erratic start so far. Again, we're not quite sure as to why, seeing as they seem to have performed much better in Interlagos, but nonetheless, Kazar in the meantime was able to overtake Daniel Bentenrieder because he outbraked himself. Kazar used the opportunity and is therefore now in a podium position. Behind them still Philip Fekler and González Cativo. We wouldn't be surprised if we saw team orders played here, seeing as they're both racing for Costag, and of course González Cativo seemingly now the number 1 driver, at least for today, seeing as Max Heyman's not here today, and therefore he's the closest driver that Costag has to competing for the championship this year in this race. Behind them, Kopieta, Waldinger, and Winter fighting for P6, P7, and P8. Winter trying to overtake Ben Swaldinger. And to no one's surprise, Fickler lets Cativo through, who's now in P5 behind Daniel Benton-Reeder and Josh Kazar. Now remember, Odilo and Kostek are part of the same group of teams, if you will, the Torino car group. Therefore, it wouldn't be surprising to see Benton-Reeder essentially let Gonzalez Cativo through at this point. It's not forbidden to do so, but let's see if they're actually going to pull that off. Now, the collision between Early and Corpetta wasn't the last time we consider his driving rather questionable today, seeing as he pushes Jan Winter into the wall, almost ends his race, and we've got to wonder why he did that, and we can see Ben Swaldinger tries to benefit off of that. Corpetta almost runs him into the wall. He outbrakes himself. Jan Winter tries to get ahead of Corpetta once again, and he will certainly get a penalty now, seeing as that was quite the dangerous maneuver. I'm sure that team boss Dominik Kronsky will not be happy about that. Now, we have to point out that after the race, Bartosz Corpetta himself admitted to having fucked up in this instance, and therefore he expects to get a penalty from Michigan. And we're going to let you know in the next video what the penalty for Bartosz Corpetta actually is. Now, Jan Winter is in P7, quite a crooked car at this point, but still he managed to get through all the midfield chaos and is now trying to catch up to Philipp Fickler, again part of the TCG, ahead of Christian Dittmer, Ben Swaldinger, Bartosz Corpetta, James Early in P11 trying to fight back, trying to overtake Bartosz Corpetta once again. Corpetta once again outbrakes himself, almost takes Ben Swaldinger out of the race. James Early trying to benefit. And he does so successfully, going around the outside of Bartosz Corpetta. Great maneuver by the debutant, who hasn't competed in the American Monoposto Championship yet, even though he's the team boss of Streamline Engineering, the man who founded the team in 2016. In the meantime, Jan Winter's trying to overtake Philipp Fickler. And Fickler's very kind in this instance, certainly almost letting him through at this point. Winter is now in P6 behind Daniel Benton-Reeder, who seems to struggle a bit with this car at this point, seeing as he was already overtaken by Josh Kazar. Now, Kazar and Cativo are fighting for P3. Of course, the Super Gazelle team boss versus the #1 driver at Kostek, at least in this scenario. It's lap 6. Kevin Peters makes a small mistake, almost chucks it into the wall of champions, and Knežević says thank you very much, trying to benefit, and he's now in the lead. Alexander Knežević leads ahead of Kevin Peters, and that would mean that for the first time this season, somebody other than Kevin Peters would win a race, though it's still a long way to go, but which means that Kevin Peters now has to find a way to overtake Alexander Knežević if he wants to win his 4th race in a row. Funnily enough, before the race, people expected Peters to dominate once again, especially considering the testing times in those long runs, but it seems as if Knežević might have a legitimate shot at winning the race at Montreal. In the meantime, James Early tries to overtake Ben Swaldinger down the straight, trying to get into a better position. Both of them outbraking themselves. Bartosz Corpetta doesn't find his brakes and chucks it into the car of James Early. Now, miraculously, neither one of them have to retire. Early can continue. Corpetta can continue, though it seems as if he struggles to control his car, therefore bumps into a Falcon car and costs Ben Swaldinger his front wing. Another incident that you could argue Bartosz Corpetta is responsible for, even though it was quite a bizarre situation. Therefore, certainly nothing to be proud of for Bartosz Corpetta in this race. 3 major incidents today, and that's why the race director told him to park his car and end his afternoon, seeing as he was considered a danger to other drivers on track. Some might even argue that that was too late. Definitely a disappointment for Schleppek, seeing as he does have the potential to be quite a competitive driver. His speed is there, but his consistency just isn't at this point. Waldinger has to get a new nose. His race is certainly compromised. Behind him, Lucas Hamilton, who's also not performed that well today. The race director will also tell him to retire the car, seeing as he was also considered a danger to other drivers around him today. Definitely a disappointment, especially compared to James Early, who again competed for the very first time in the American Monoposto Championship and still managed to pull off quite a great drive, and it would only get better for him, as we can already tell you. Now, in the meantime, Jan Winter actually managed to overtake Daniel Benton-Reeder, seeing as he made a mistake and is therefore now in P5. Again, that would be a great result for Winter, especially considering what happened at the start. But I wonder whether or not they're going to be a bit annoyed about how Daniel Benton-Reeder races today, seeing as his performance could also be considered quite erratic. Winter once again fighting his way through the field, lap 9, trying to outbrake Josh Kazar, and he does so brilliantly, though you could argue that could have led to a big collision if Kazar hadn't gone out of the way. There was Benz Waldinger in the way as well, but he manages to overtake Josh Kazar and is now in P4. Without a doubt, a great recovery drive from Winter so far, you have to acknowledge that. The duel between Peters and Knežević continues, again both fighting for a race win. Peters trying to overtake Alexander Knežević before the first round of pit stops, and he does so around the outside before the Wall of Champions. Now the question is Knežević able to counter that into the first turn? He is not, and therefore Peters now once again in the lead, which leads to Knežević pitting that same lap, maybe trying to pull off an undercut on Kevin Peters, but nonetheless, Peters is now once again in the race lead, and it looks as if maybe Kevin Peters might be able to win his 4th race in a row if things go to plan from this point. In the meantime, Kevin Peters is headed for the pits, as well as Gonzalez Cativo. Josh Kazar, interestingly enough, stays out longer than all of them and is therefore now in the lead. Meanwhile, Kevin Peters manages to get out ahead of Alexander Knežević, therefore the undercut didn't work, and Peters is now virtually in the race lead once again. Now, interestingly enough, after 2 of the 3 Odilo cars pitted, those being Daniel Bentenrieder and Jan Winter, Bentenrieder came out ahead of Jan Winter. Now, we're not sure whether that's because of the fuel loads that they put in the car or that's because of the damage being repaired on their cars, but nonetheless, Jan Winter once again is behind Daniel Bentenrieder, which might lead to a bit of a kerfuffle considering that Daniel Bentenrieder has been quite erratic today. And I can already tell you that the guys behind the TCG aren't really happy with how Daniel Bentenrieder performed today, including Alexander Knežević and Gonzalez Cativo. Now, after Kazar and early pitted, Peters was in the lead ahead of Knežević, Gonzalez Cativo in 3rd, ahead of Kazar, Bentenrieder, Winter, Philipp Fekela, Christian Dittmer, James Early, Stefan Cerne in 10th, ahead of Waldinger and Hamilton. Now, Waldinger was told to retire as well as Krpeta and Hamilton before him, seeing as he was also considered a danger to other drivers around him. Certainly not a great day for MPM so far, despite the fact that Kevin Peters is still in the lead of the race. Now, Daniel Bentenrieder's weird day continues. He cuts the chicane before the Wall of Champions. He still stays ahead of Jan Winter, and you gotta wonder whether or not the Odilo boys are gonna try to implement team orders at this point, seeing as Jan Winter is much quicker, and they do so. Daniel Bentenrieder lets Jan Winter through, and therefore Winter is now back in P5, Bentenrieder's in P6, but Winter almost spins Bentenrieder's through once again, so those two are kind of fighting at this point, though we're convinced that's not what the team bosses at the TCG and Odilo want to see. Though only a few turns later, Daniel Bentenrieder would chuck it into the wall, lose his front wing, and therefore that problem was solved, but to the annoyance of both the Kostak team and the Odilo Racing team, Daniel Bentenrieder would decide to retire despite only having to replace his front wing, and therefore you can imagine that the TCG wasn't really happy with his performance in Montreal. Now, while at this point everything looks set for a Kevin Peters race victory, we still see some interesting battles in the midfield between James Early and Christian Dittmer. Now, both of them had to let the leaders through, those being Kevin Peters and Alexander Knežević, and Dittmer decides to overtake James Early off track, which he wasn't allowed to do, and therefore he was told by the race director to let James Early through once again, to the annoyance of the Falcon boys. It took him a while to do so, and we're still unsure whether or not he let James Early through because the race director told him to, or if he just outbraked himself and therefore he had to let James Early through, otherwise those two would have collided. Therefore, the standings are now Kevin Peters in the lead ahead of Alexander Knežević, Gonzalez Cativo in 3rd ahead of Josh Kazar in 4th, behind them Winter in 5th, Fekela in 6th, James Early in a respectable 7th, Christian Dittmer in 8th, Stefan Cerne in 9th, and Benz Waldinger in P10 after he was told to retire. Now, it has to be said that during the second stint, Alexander Knežević lost a ton of time compared to Kevin Peters, and therefore it looks as if Peters might be headed for his 4th victory in a row. Knežević coming out behind Gonzalez Cativo. Meanwhile, Josh Kazar and Jan Winter are fighting for P4. Again, brilliant recovery drive by Jan Winter, having the better traction down the long straight in the 3rd sector, and he's already ahead of Josh Kazar before they even come close to the final chicane. Kazar tries to counter, but he's not able to do so, while Jan Winter decides to pit for a second time today. just like Alexander Knežević, who's now in P3 ahead of Josh Kazar, who once again stays out longer than other competitors around him. That competitor in this case being Jan Winter. And therefore you'd assume that the fight is still on for P2, P3, P4, P5, but you wouldn't expect anybody to be able to compete with Kevin Peters today until this happened. The MPM driver's engine blows up, he has to pull off the track, he retires, and therefore the first safety car of the race is deployed, and now anything is possible with the championship leader having to retire for the very first time this season. Kevin Peters has to retire, and therefore now literally anybody could win this race. Both Gonzalez Cativo and Alexander Knežević decide to pit once again, as well as Josh Kazar. Now, the only one who didn't decide to pit during the safety car phase was Jan Winter. He stayed out ahead of everybody and is therefore now in the race lead after his great recovery drive ahead of Gonzalez Cativo and Alexander Knežević. Kazar in 4th, Early in 5th, Fekler in 6th, Dittmer in 7th, and Serna in 8th. And theoretically, all of them are now fighting for a race victory. After a few laps, the safety car comes in once again, and Jan Winter's in the lead. Behind them, Knežević and Cativo are fighting for P2, Kazar in P4. Everybody able to maneuver through turns 1 and 2. Now, we're interested to see whether or not the midfield guys can keep up with the two Odilo cars and Gonzalez Cativo. Kazar in 4th. Behind him, Fekler, who's able to overtake James Early once again. Behind him, the two Falcon boys, who seem to be off pace today. And it looks as if the two Odilo cars and Gonzalez Cativo are now fighting for a race victory. Again, Jan Winter didn't pit, and he's able to already build a gap to both Alexander Knežević and Gonzalez Cativo, and we've got to wonder, is he able to finish the race on this fueler, or does he have to go into the pits one more time? Currently, it doesn't look as if he can finish the race on this fuel load considering his speed, but at the same time, you never know. Cativo fighting with Knežević. Behind them, Kazar and Fekler. Still a bit of a gap to James Early and the two Falcon boys. Look at Cativo trying to overtake Alexander Knežević around the outside. They bump into each other just a tad bit, and he's now ahead of the Bosnian veteran, who doesn't bump into the back of him, thankfully. But look at Jan Winter, he's already going 1.5 seconds quicker than everybody else on track, which means that he might actually be in a position to build enough of a gap to pit one more time and still be in with a shout for race victory if he manages to keep up this pace. Now Fekler trying to go around the outside of Josh Kazar in a place where usually you wouldn't expect him to do so. What a great maneuver from Philip Fekler, who's now in P4. Kudos to Fekler for a brave but successful maneuver. He's now in P4. Speaking of ambitious, Gonzalez Cativo obviously wants to win this race, but he spins, keeps it on track, but Alexander Knežević certainly now sees an opening to overtake the Mexican driver once again, trying to do so at the end of the long straight in Sector 3, but doesn't manage to do so just yet. But Cativo's definitely under pressure after not being able to win the second and third round of the American Monoposto Championship, despite the fact that he and Knežević had the pace to do so. Neither one of them were able to beat Kevin Peters. Now they have a big chance to not only beat Kevin Peters, seeing as he's already had to retire, but to eat into the championship lead of Kevin Peters big time today. Jan Winter now with quite a big gap to Cativo. Cativo with a bit of a gap to Alexander Knežević. Meanwhile, the two friendos, buddies, chums, if you will, fighting with each other. James Early and Josh Kazar, again, both those two have known each other for quite a while through the F1 Challenge community. So you could consider that a bit of a personal battle between those two in P5 and P6, though I've got to wonder whether or not James Early wants to employ a dive bomb at this stage of the race, seeing as he would surely be happy with at least a few points after what we've seen from him today, after he also had to pull off a bit of a recovery drive like Jan Winter, so I doubt he's going to be too risky in his maneuvers against Josh Kazar, but who knows? And we talked about Gonzalez Cativo almost spinning. He now spins entirely. Knežević says thank you very much. He's now back in P2. And does that mean that Gonzalez Cativo has once again chucked away a potential race victory? Behind him, Fekler, Kazar, and Early still dueling. And the fierce veteran is definitely going to be angry with himself after the race, seeing as that might have cost him a shot at victory today. Again, that all depends on where Jan Winter is gonna come out if he decides to pit one more time. We're still unsure whether he has to pit one more time or not. Cativo now once again at the back of Alexander Knežević trying to overtake him, but in the background we see Josh Kazar chucking it into the wall of champions. We told you about it being infamous, and it looks as if that might be the end for Josh Kazar's race. He's lost his front wing. He decides to retire. Boy, he's got to be angry with himself at this point. He wasn't able to finish the race in Interlagos after losing his motor, and he's not able to finish the race in Montreal after losing his front wing and potentially wrecking his entire car, which means that Fekkeler and Early are now fighting for 4th position. In the meantime, both Falcon drivers have decided to retire as well. We're not sure as to why they've decided to do so, but nonetheless, Jan Winter's still in the lead ahead of both Alexander Knežević and Gonzalez Cativo, who are still fighting for P2 or a potential race victory. Look at Cativo trying to overtake Knežević around the outside, and again, he's got to be angry with himself, seeing as this might be his biggest chance yet to win a race in the American Monoposto Championship. Meanwhile, Knežević knows that if Winter decides to pit one more time, he's in a pretty good position to win the race, seeing as you would expect team orders to be deployed in that situation, seeing as Alexander Knežević is the most realistic candidate to win the American Monoposto Championship this year for Odilo. And on lap 38, Jan Winters finally decides to pit, which means that Alexander Knežević is now in the lead ahead of Gonzalez Cativo. Both of them are now realistically fighting for a race victory. Winter comes out behind Fekkeler and barely ahead of James Early, who was a bit surprised that Jan Winter was actually in a position to still be fought with. Now only a few minutes to go in this race. Can Jan Winter make up the time necessary to win the 4th round of the American Monoposto Championship, or is either one of these going to win the race? Cativo once again trying to overtake around the outside of Alexander Knežević, doesn't manage to do so, outbrakes himself, and therefore race victory certainly isn't in the grasp of Gonzalez Cativo anymore. Winter passes Cativo. Fekkeler spins in the process, which means that James Early is now in P3. Wouldn't that be a sensation if the debutant managed to finish the race in P3 after being lapped throughout the race? What an incredible development. Again, once again, Cativo maybe a bit overambitious after he was angry with himself, frustrated with the entire situation, binning it, and therefore losing a potential race victory. Now, Knežević is in the lead ahead of Jan Winter, James Early in 3rd, Fekkeler in 4th. We can tell you he's going to wait for his teammate to overtake him once again, despite the fact that he's had to do a long pit stop to change his front wing. He's going to wait. He's allowed to do that, but that is certainly going to raise some eyebrows considering that he would cruise around at almost ridiculously slow speed to wait for Gonzalez Cativo. But that's not what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the fact that Jan Winter catches up to Alexander Knežević quite quickly. He's about 2 to 3 seconds faster every lap, and it looks as if he might be able to catch the Bosnian veteran, though I'm not sure whether or not they're going to be allowed to race with each other. If I were in the team boss's position, I certainly wouldn't let them race, but it looks as if they might actually be allowed to race, though Alexander Knežević certainly won't enjoy that. It's the last lap of the race, and we've got to wonder who's going to win the 4th round of the American Monoposto Championship, Jan Winter or Alexander Knežević. Now look at Jan Winter waiting for Alexander Knežević to make a mistake. Again, Knežević the one fighting for the American Monoposto Championship this season. If we look at the point standings, he's the most realistic candidate to compete with Kevin Peters, so it would be incredibly important for him to win this race. But then again, who knows what Jan Winter is going to do? We're certainly going to ask both of them about this after the race. Look at Jan Winter wiggling again. It's not as if he didn't make any mistakes today, so we've got to wonder whether or not he's actually gonna do one big risky dive bomb and therefore maybe actually cause James Early to win his first race of the season. Look at Winter trying to go around the outside at the hairpin. Don't bin it in the last lap, guys. What a thrilling finish to the race. Again, going down the long back straight. He might actually pull it off. He's getting alongside of Knežević. Neither of them giving an inch. Winter, though it doesn't look as if he can pull it off. Going through the last chicane, and it looks as if Alexander Knežević is going to win the 4th race of the championship. Congratulations to Alexander Knežević, winning by what seems to be only an inch. Winter finishes 2nd. What a brilliant recovery drive from Jan Winter. James Early finishes in 3rd, and as we predicted, Feckler finishes in 5th, and Gonzalez Cativo still gets the points for P4. Important, very important in this year's championship, but nonetheless, the winner of today's race is Alexander Knežević, and we're going to talk to him right now. So, Mr. Knežević, first of all, congratulations. You finally won a race this season, and for some time it looked as if you could win the race, then it looked as if you couldn't win the race, then it looked as if you could, and then you couldn't, and then you could, and then you could. What the hell happened out there? Like, it's difficult for me to comprehend, and I watched the whole damn thing as a steward.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, it was really a race of up and downs, and I'm very happy in the end to win it. But for one part of the race, it looked like I could win it. Then for many other parts, it was looking, a little bit worse. So it was an emotional race. I was elated, in the end to hold on to first place, and I hope that more wins will come.
I mean, points-wise, you're now in the championship fight after Kevin Peters blew his engine. I mean, what is next for you, the Odilo guys? I mean, Michigan is next in 2 weeks. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about the rest of the championship?
It was a shocker for Kevin blowing his engine. We were surprised. I think he also. We're in the fight now. I hope that I can put pressure on Kevin. Maybe he makes some more mistakes. I think that we are leading the Constructors' Championship now, and we hope to hold it. I mean, I hope that we can, be on the podium again in Michigan.
Jan Winter, du tauchst wieder auf, nachdem du nicht da warst, und fährst direkt aufs Podium, nachdem ja eigentlich dein Rennen nach der ersten Kurve fast gelaufen war, gefühlt.
Ja, ich kann es kaum selber noch gar nicht fassen, was jetzt hier in dem Rennen abging. Aber ich muss auch ehrlich gestehen, so, das war so wegen das erste Rennen, wo ich mal wegen mehr trainiert habe, schon 2 Tage zuvor, statt erst am Renntag so, ne? Mal ein bisschen mehr mit Vorbild vorangehen. Aber es lag halt vor allem auch daran, weil Montreal eigentlich mit zu meinen Lieblingsstrecken gehört. Und ich habe mir auch dann schon vorgenommen gestern, ich habe zu Knese gesagt, ich hole hier den Sieg. Und nach der ersten Kurve dachte ich mir so, okay, das war es wieder komplett. Aber komplett verrücktes Rennen, dass wir dann noch irgendwie da 1 und 2 erwischt haben und ich halt vor allem noch auf dem Podium gelandet bin. Absolut unfassbar. Ich kann es nicht glauben, aber bestes Ergebnis. Mehr konnten wir nicht rausholen. Ja.
Das muss man natürlich kritisch nachfragen in meiner pseudojournalistischen Position. Du hattest natürlich viele intensive Zweikämpfe, einige Kontroverse darunter auch dabei, die unter anderem vermutlich auch Strafen nach sich ziehen werden. Ich referenziere unter anderem das Duell gegen Bartosz Korpeta, aber du hast ja am Ende noch gegen deinen Teamkollegen gekämpft, obwohl der ja irgendwo um die Meisterschaft kämpft. Was hat's damit auf sich?
Es war in meinem Kopf, ne? Aber ich dachte mir so, komm, gib mal einen Try, ein Versuch, einfach mal schauen. Und weil ich halt eben gestern zu ihm gesagt hatte, ich hole den Sieg hier. Und ja, leider nicht. Deswegen, ich bin nicht so aggressiv gefahren. Ich habe es probiert. In der Kurve unmöglich, weil ich da links bin. Und dann ganz klar verdient das Sieg an Alexander.
Now, congratulations on your podium. Something tells me you didn't expect to finish P3. How's the race for you? Are you happy with your performance? What do you feel right now?
Well, it was a crazy race to start with. Tons of action, not just for me, but for the whole field, it seemed. After the first lap, I think I lost quite a few positions. Well, actually, I think I lost 1 position off the start. And then there was an incident with another driver down at the hairpin on maybe lap 3 or 4. That put me down to 12th place, pretty much last. So Streamline were running 12th and 13th at that point. Started climbing my way back up the field, and then the same driver crashed into me again. Gave my car quite a bit of damage, so I was down a couple seconds per lap on lap time. Came into the pits, I had close to a minute pit stop, put me a lap down, and then as soon as the race leader retired due to the engine failure, I managed to gain my lap back, and through other incidents and issues, I somehow found myself in 3rd place. I was very happy to finish there. Surprisingly, after I jumped up to 3rd place, I thought, you know what, maybe there'll be even more incidents, maybe I can win. But of course, that's me just dreaming, so I'm very happy with 3rd place.
So here's the rest of the results for those interested. Funnily enough, almost nobody other than the top 4 finished, if you consider Philipp Fekler a finisher due to him being part of the race for most of it. Josh Kazar finishes P6 ahead of Zerne, Dittmar, Peters, Waldinger, Bentenrieder, Hamilton, and Corpetta. Everybody from P9 downwards only getting half points, seeing as they didn't complete 75% of the race distance. And it looks as though the championship is now wide open, with Alexander Knežević only 9 points behind Kevin Peters and Gonzalez Cativo less than 20 points behind the MPM driver. Meanwhile, in the team's championship, it looks as if we're headed for a two-way fight between Odilo and Kostek for this year's team's championship, unless MPM can find a way to recruit drivers that are on the level of Kevin Peters. But unless that doesn't happen, it looks pretty bleak when it comes to this year's team's championship for MPM. Other than that, you'll hear from us in 2 weeks when the American Monoposto Championship is headed for Michigan and the first proper oval race of this year's championship. Until then, thank you for watching and keep racing.